what I want to do with you tonight is to tease out some of the aspects of ancient Israelite education by reconstructing their elementary scribal education. I think that if we understand the scribal education, the curriculum, we can actually tease out how the Bible became a book in a little more concrete way. So in some ways, this lecture is a culmination of books I've written and research I've done before. But I didn't really have all the evidence I wanted. And I wanted to make a much more concrete contribution to exactly how the Bible became a book. And the belief is, if you know what they studied in school, and you know the texts they studied in school, maybe you can take those texts and show how exactly the Bible is being composed. Now the problem is, up until very recently, we had almost no evidence of scribal curriculum in ancient Israel. We didn't know what scribes studied in school. There were a few examples, like the Tel Zion Abecediary, this Bet Sarta Abecediary, Kadesh Barnea, down in the Negev has some numerical exercises. But the inscriptional evidence for education was very little. For example, in a very popular recent book by Carol Vandertoorn on scribal culture, he said that, quote, "Our knowledge of scribal curriculum in ancient Israel is almost nil." And I think he was right, for the most part. Or, I would say he was right until my new interpretation of the Kuntillet Ajrud inscriptions, which started me on the lecture that I'm offering, the ideas that I'm offering you here tonight. The book came out only in 2012. Here's the title page of the book. Now it's also in a Hebrew edition from 2015. These inscriptions were actually discovered in the 1970s, but they were published kind of in a piecemeal, article here, an article there. The whole site was not published. And because the whole site was not published in a holistic way, we weren't fully able to understand the implications of the inscriptions. And that's what I want to talk about and kind of tease out with you tonight. First of all, let me begin with an idea about where exactly this site of Kuntillet Ajrud here. It's located in the Negev, down here in the south, you see, along what's called the Darb el Gaza route from the Red Sea in the south to the Mediterranean Sea at Gaza, and it hits major sites of what is modern day Elat in the south, then goes to Kuntillet Ajrud, Kadesh Barnea, and finally up to Gaza in the desert. It was a major site probably and chosen just because in this very arid, remote region, it had access to water cisterns, and actually its modern Arabic name, Kuntillet Ajrud, means the hill of the water well. So that's why it was found. It's also one of the reasons that the inscriptions there were found in such good quality. Tonight I'm going to be looking at, I want to show you a few of the different inscriptions, just sort of briefly show you what I'm going to be looking at in terms of the inscription. There are two cute, large pithoi jars, about this tall, that have inscriptions written all around them. In addition to these pithoi that we're going to look at in detail, there are plaster wall inscriptions that are found here. I have one example of inscription 4.11 here. You have 3 inscriptions up here, and then 3 in the back of the fortress. Inscriptions 4.1 and through 4.3 were found right in the gate area near Pithos A and B. And actually, in that gate area, here's inscription 4.3. It was found, that one inscription was found actually on the wall, but still very, very poorly preserved. The other 5 plaster inscriptions were all on the floor of the fortress and relatively poorly preserved, but still nonetheless significant. Pretty fragmentary, but significant. So all these inscriptions are relatively fragmentary. So I asked myself, I've got some basics here. How am I going to fill in the blanks, right? I don't have enough information here to get it all. I need to fill in the blanks. So I started looking around, and one of the places I thought we can fill in the blanks were from Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia and cuneiform, we have large amount of cuneiform school texts and very, very detailed idea of the curriculum. And you find these texts in all different places throughout the Near East. Here's one example of one of these school texts. This is a little fragment of a late bronze school text. This is from around 1200 BC from Ashkelon in Israel. So part of the appropriateness of this model is that this cuneiform curriculum was being used in Israel about the time the early Israelites came into the land. And the argument is that they're not going to invent this out of curriculum from nothing, but rather they're going to adapt models of the cuneiform curriculum. And I'll give you examples of how that works in the course of this lecture. But what I've given you here is an outline of a chart from Nick Veldhuis, one of his many works on cuneiform literacy, that basically outlines the categories of cuneiform curriculum. It goes from scribal signs, exercises, to thematic lists, and basically spelling lists of different types, to eventually numerical exercises, which is kind of like learning how to do accounting, to learning and memorizing phrases and sentences and sort of different kinds of models of writing, like how to write a letter, for example. And I really want to emphasize here that I'm looking for a vector of transmission from cuneiform to alphabetic to justify filling in the blanks from cuneiform. So I'm going to give you a little bit of my evidence for this. One of the examples is from the New Kingdom Administration in the El Amarna text. El Amarna was a site, you see it at the bottom of the little map, in Egypt, in central Egypt. And in El Amarna, we have over 300 letters written from Canaanite rulers in cuneiform language to Pharaoh in Egypt. But not only do we have 300 letters written from a variety of different Canaanite rulers, including the ruler of Jerusalem, the ruler of Hatzor, other places in Israel, but we also have school exercises there. So they're practicing how to write there, and so we know that they were learning the curriculum in El Amarna, from El Amarna. So that begins to give us like this little bit of evidence about the vector of transmission from cuneiform to the developing early alphabetic curriculum for Hebrew. Okay, so going back to our chart, I'm going to come back to this many times in this lecture. I'm going to start with sign exercises. I'm going to compare them to ABCDaries. ABCDaries are essentially ABCs. In cuneiform, it's the tu, ta, ti. You learned your tu, ta, and your ti, not your A, B, and C. And this is an example of a tablet. And these are the most common things we actually knew about before we found the Kuntillet Ajrud inscriptions. So let's begin with this particular jar. It's called Pithos B, and that's hard to read, so I'm going to show you what I call a projection drawing. So that means we're going to roll out that jar into a drawing that makes it all flat so we can see the whole thing. Right? So this is called a projection drawing, and this is of B. And you see on the right-hand side here, there are going to be 4 ABCDaries that I'm going to look at with you. That actually almost doubled the number of ABCDaries we had before we found this jar. But on the top left, it's really interesting. You see the top left, you have them practicing the letter Yod. Essentially the English letter, we transcribe it as a Y. But they're practicing the letter Yod. They're writing it over and over and over and over again, as if they're kind of doodling here, right? So that gives you a sense. And part of what I want to do, the reason I want to show you this, is I want to give you a sense of the whole jar. The problem of these inscriptions is that they never publish everything together. They publish every little part of the inscription as though it were separate from all the other inscriptions on the jar. But I think when you look at the whole jar and everything that's going to go out, it's going to help me contextualize some of the other exercises. So let's go back here to the right-hand side of the jar. I'm going to give you a close-up now of the 4 abecedaries. And you can kind of see if you don't know your Hebrew, you can see on the top right here, right, you've got an Aleph, Bet, Gimel on line 1. This is like ABC, only in Hebrew, of course, ABG, or Aleph, Bet, Gimel. Line 1 is actually 2 lines. It's A and B. So they got halfway through the alphabet, and then they finished it on line 1B there. One of the things that's important to notice here is to illustrate what I mean about the original publication of this, and also even in the official publication, is that I gave these line numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because that's the way they're lined up. The official publication in 2012 gives them the numbers 311, 3.7, 3.12, 3.13, 3.8, 3.14. By doing that, they decontextualize the relationship of these different inscriptions, which they do over and over again. Aleph is barely visible right here. There's the Bet, this is the Gimel. And then this is hard to read, especially in the drawing, but there'd be a Dalet here, and then there's a little bit of the Hey. This is the Het in Hebrew. And then the Kuf, the Resh, the Shin, and the Tav are very well preserved. This is the top of the P or the Pei. So that's that. And then here you can see that it's only part of it. The right-hand side of it is kind of erased. Again, only part of it here and only part of it here. There are a number of things also that are very interesting about this in terms of teaching. One is, you notice it's written in red and black ink. This is very, very typical of Egyptian school texts. The red is for rubrics, usually of the master's hand, and the black is usually the student's hand in Egyptian writing. And the Israelites certainly borrowed this technology of writing in ink from the Egyptians, but you can also see easily that the red ink has a much more stylized, expert hand as opposed to the black ink. There are other things that are indicative of school text. For example, the use of this line as a separating line of a school, of a text on the left and then a text on the right, is something you see over and over in a variety of different school texts. I'm actually going to show you an example in a couple minutes as I get a little bit further. But I just want to point out the various things that are indicating that, you know, this is a school practice text. And there are also erasures that you see in this text. So you see, you see right here, the Pei and this is a Yod. They're actually marked in the inscription because they're written so faintly and they're written on a different line. It's because they probably were erased. And there are a number of places in the inscription that you have erasures. Well, this makes perfect sense if you think of this huge pot as kind of a blackboard, right? So they're writing, they're erasing it, and then they're writing over it. Occasionally, you can see the background of the earlier writing in a variety of different places, but here you can see the Pei and the Yod. You can also see that there are multiple hands writing here, even to the uninstructed, right? To people who aren't studying epigraphy, I'm going to teach you to be a little bit of an epigrapher here. And you can notice this is the letter Kof or Q. You can see the Q up here. Here's the Kof right here. Here's the Kof right here. This is a more archaic Kof, but written in a more stylized hand. Here's a slightly bent Kof slightly more stylized or maybe incorrect. And you can see that these two written by the student don't have the line through the top. But here's another example that's even more interesting. This is the letter Sheen or S. You can see normally it looks kind of like a W. Here's a W and down here. But you can see whoever's writing this line didn't actually quite write it correctly. They wrote it as two V's instead of a W. So you can see some aspects of a student and a master writing in this text. Okay, so these are our four abecedaries, and you can see already that you've got multiple hands of a master and a student in this text. Okay, let's take a look now at a more interesting set of lists, and these are geographical personal names that you have, but also there are other kinds of lists. For example, later on we're going to look at things like trees and wooden objects, animals, thematic lists. So in some ways you can think of this as not that different than the way education goes in a modern school, right? First grade you have certain kinds of lists of words you learn. Second grade you have certain kinds of lists. And these lists become very, very rigid, right? Not just rigid in modern school, but in ancient Mesopotamia, the lists are so rigid that even if you have a small fragment of the list, you can reconstruct the entire list just on the basis of the small fragment, because we find these lists by the thousands in Mesopotamia, and whether you're in Iraq or Syria or in Israel and you find the lists are sign for sign exactly the same. The other thing that's interesting about this particular example is I'm giving you an example that I mentioned before of a lexical list where the master wrote on the left-hand side and the right-hand side was the student writing. There was a line that separated the two, and you don't see any writing anymore because they keep scratching the clay off and writing it again, scratching the clay off, writing it again. So they're practicing writing this advanced list. So this brings us back to a list I showed you in brief a second ago, which is this list right here, the Ashkelon list. It's going to be really important for us because I'm going to use it to illustrate the vector of transmission in early Israel. And I think we have on our inscription at least two examples of lists. And the first example is right here. I'm going to call it a lexical list. It's important to categorize it or interpret it in the context of the other things that are going on here. So this is, again, something that wasn't recognized in the original publication in 2012, partly because they separated the relationship of the abecedaries from this particular text. You have line 3.7, which is too fragmentary. There's only one word maybe in it to know exactly what's going on. But in line 5, or 3.8, you have parts of three different words. Two of the words are the words Shomron and probably Sha'arayim. Now, the first word is very clear, Shomron, as Samaria. The second word in Hebrew can be a lot of different things. So it could be the word for hair, it could be the word for barley, which is the way the original publication suggested. I'd actually suggest that it should be interpreted as the word Sha'arayim, which is a place name. And the reason I'm going to interpret it that way is because that was a very common thing to do in terms of learning lexical lists. You had to learn the names of places. If you were going to be a scribe, you need to know how to write the word Tucson, know how to write the word Phoenix, know how to write the word Los Angeles. Correctly, it was important to learn how to write names correctly. So this is one of the basic things that you did. So from that perspective, I think it's really important. The other thing that's really interesting about this is that they're in exact alphabetical order. So the Shin Mem of Shomron is followed naturally by a Shin Ayin of Sha'arayim. So it's written in an alphabetical order. Now, it's only fragmentary. Obviously, I'm just giving you a little piece, but it shows you the kind of things that scribes were probably learning in school. Here's a second example. Over here on the far left, you have a list, and it's a list of personal names. It's the word Shekanyao, Amos, Shemariah, Eliyahu, Uzziyahu, and then the fifth one is Mitzri, which can either be a personal name or just an Egyptian, so a gentilic describing. Now, these names are sometimes identified with these 5 characters that are to the right of them. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not really entirely sure. The original interpretation of these 5 figures were that they were worshipers. But I think a much more compelling interpretation is in the recent publication in 2015 in Hebrew only by Tali Ornan of the Hebrew University, where she shows that all the drawings on this pot, these 2 pots, are actually consistent with Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions and palace inscriptions. So, although they have religious themes, just because you have religious themes doesn't mean it's a religious text or a religious drawing. In the Neo-Assyrian palace inscriptions, there are lots of religious themes. It's just as plausible that you have a procession of people that are bowing homage to the king as bowing homage to a particular god. But the other thing important here is that lists of personal names were probably one of the most important things that a would-be scribe or bureaucrat would learn. Most of the texts that a scribe would write in their life were business documents, receipts, different kinds of things, and the ability to write names accurately was one of the most important things you had to do. You find lots of these kinds of texts in Mesopotamia. Okay, now I can't understate the importance of lists in the cuneiform scribal curriculum, right? They were not only ways of learning how to read and write personal names, but they were ways of organizing knowledge. So the second category of lists that you get are things in Mesopotamia, you would learn thematic lists. So for example, the trees and wooden objects were the first thematic lists that Assyrian scribes learned. Then after they learned, names for trees and wooden items, the next thing that they learned were animals, different kinds of animals. And then, other kinds of things like, meat, metals, leather objects, ceramics, so there were all kinds of different things. But the first thing that you learned were trees and wooden objects. That's going to be important, otherwise I wouldn't be repeating it over and over again, right? Okay, so let me give you one example of this. I think this is really cool. This is a Neo-Assyrian lexical school text. It extracts from the traditional thing. The word gish in Sumerian is a determinative to mean tree or wooden object. And so on the left hand of the column, all the way up and down the column, you have the word gish that begins the Sumerian word, then an Akkadian word. Sometimes you have another column for another language, like West Semitic, like precursor to Hebrew. You find these kind of lists all over, but it's really interesting that one of the places you find them is in the Amarna corpus of scholarly texts. And they do a really interesting thing. They have a local adaptation of the Mesopotamian school curriculum. So actually, in this particular adaptation, you have the Akkadian column with the gish, and then the different kinds of trees and wooden objects, a door, or a wooden bolt, a wooden post, a chair, a bed, a table. And then the Egyptian column is actually on the left of the Egyptian words. So they're taking the traditional Mesopotamian curriculum, and they're doing local adaptation of the curriculum. Now here's the kicker. Isn't it interesting, right? That when we come to this story about Solomon's wisdom, that we all know, God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, a breadth of understanding, that it caps his encyclopedic knowledge by saying he would speak of the trees from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows in the wall, and he would speak of the animals and birds and reptiles and fish. It just always struck me when I used to see this as this kind of a bizarre way of talking about Solomon's wisdom. But when you realize that trees and then animals were two of the central thematic categories that Mesopotamians organized their knowledge by, suddenly it seems much more significant. Okay, it gets even more interesting. So, many years ago, a calendar was discovered called the Gezer calendar, actually by Bill Deaver, at Bill Deaver's site of the University of Arizona. And this calendar has been a very difficult thing to interpret by a lot of scholars. Some people thought it was a school text, some think it's a magical text, some people think it's just, an agricultural calendar, so if you wanted to know when to plant your crops. It doesn't really actually work that well as a calendar, but a very interesting thing. There are a number of things, though, when you look more carefully at this thing in a calendar, which just reads, as you see here, months of gathering, months of sowing, months of late sowing, months of cutting flax, months of reaping barley, and so on and so forth. A number of things are really interesting. I just remind you of the aesthetics of the way thematic lists worked in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, the first column was always the same sign, because you had to say, this is a determinant, this is wood, or whatever, and then whatever followed. And you get these kind of aesthetics in the presentation of lists. And you get these aesthetics in the presentation of lists in a variety of different contexts. So we can go 2,000 years later and look at the Leningrad Codex in our famous, chapter 3 of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes. We have, the famous, or it was the bird song, right? There's a time for everything. There's a season and a time for every matter under heaven. And in the left-hand column here is always the word 8 in Hebrew for a time, and you can see in here that they create an aesthetic for it. Now that seems to me what is also going on in the Gezer calendar. I won't bore you with the particulars of why the student made this particular mistake, but you can see that down the right-hand side of this, the first word is always the word Yoreach, which is the word month in Hebrew. Now some of you might be saying, that's not the word for month in Hebrew. What's the word for month in Hebrew? Chodesh. Why would they say Yoreach if Chodesh is the word for month in Hebrew, right? Yeah, it's the word for moon. It works, right? Yeah. It works even better if we go and look at our Ashkelon tablet. So, in our Ashkelon tablet, this one's really interesting on a couple levels. First of all, in the cuneiform lists, one of the things that they do is they just juxtapose reaping, eretsu, and this words for reaping and agriculture, and words for time, beginning with the word archu in Akkadian, which means month. But in our particular example, this is the general Mesopotamian calendar, right? With reaping and month right next to each other, juxtaposed. But in our Ashkelon thing, we actually have a third column given it to. So here's the Akkadian word archu, and then they put an extra word Iarhu, which is actually West Semitic. Now, you can see it's really fragmentary here, but we actually have this entire text, sign for sign, with the West Semitic or Canaanite or precursor to Hebrew column at a place called Amar. So we can reconstruct this entire thing because we have it in another place with this column, and the word Iarhu is essentially the West Semitic word Yoreach. So why, I would say, why did they use the word Yoreach Well, that was the tradition of the Mesopotamian cuneiform school. It was a word in Hebrew that worked for month. It wasn't the natural word that necessarily used for month. But school curriculum tends to be very conservative. And tends to be adapted locally. Now, there are all sorts of other places that you find lists and adaptations of lists. I'm going to just get, I can give you a couple here. I'm going to skip through them. But there are lots of places in the Bible that they're adapting lists. We have cuneiform examples, and then we have biblical examples. I want to get to a couple things, so I'm going to skip a little bit here. You have numerical exercises also, right? You have to learn how to do accounting, right? So numerical exercises are an important part of the cuneiform curriculum. This is a fragment of that tradition found at Hatzor, again dating to the end of the Late Bronze Age, a metrical tablet with multiplication tables. At Kuntillet Ajrud, this is really interesting, I think they found practice numbers. Now, they didn't identify them as practice numbers in the original SketchUp of this Pithos A. But that looks like 1, 2, 3, and 4, 2 to me. It looks even more like 1, 2, 3, and 4 if you just flip it over. So I just flipped the jar over. Now, flipping the jar over does a number of really interesting things. But first of all, the letter Yod that someone is practicing right here is now right side up instead of upside down. So that's the proof that someone flipped this over. But also now the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 work really well, and number 5 and 6 seem to be inside. But it gets even more interesting. In the original publication, they suggested all this stuff over here was just scribbles, which it does look like a little bit if it's upside down. But if you start studying numbers in ancient Hebrew inscriptions well, you'll begin to recognize that this little kind of sideways T right here, and you can see it in publications, is actually the number 10 in hieratic numerals that the Israelite scribes used. And also, these other scribbles, these look like the number 70. It's like a 3 with a tail on it. And this guy right over here looks like the number 30. So they're not scribbles at all, as the original publication suggested. They're actually practicing writing numbers just like they're practicing writing the letter 3. And just in case you weren't convinced, if you just went 50 kilometers north of here, you would find 6 ostracon of accounting exercises at Kadesh Barnea that fit exactly well with what we have going on here. Now let me just end with, I've kind of gone on too long. This is just too exciting. Let me give you, they're also practicing writing letters, and model contracts. And we find these letters, here's one letter on Pithos B, right above our practice letters and our practice numbers. It's fragmentary, but it says, message of someone, speak to Yacheli and to Yoash, blessed to you God of Samaria and his Asherah, right? This is the beginning of a letter. Here's another example. We'll go back to our other inscription, and over here, right here, next to our ABCDs and lists, and up here, we have letter templates. So, for example, the one next to our ABCD reads, the speech of our Marial, speak to my Lord, are you well? May he bless you to Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah, may he keep you, may he be with you, be with my Lord. Now, this isn't a real letter. It's written on a pithoi next to a bunch of ABCDaries. And the other thing is, there's no contents of the letter, right? It's just the introduction, because that's what you need to learn. So they learn the introduction. And letter writing, which you find in 3 examples here, had an enormous impact on the Hebrew Bible. In framing of biblical narratives, they're essentially framed as messages that carry the narrative from one person to another. They're mundane parts of biblical style. For example, the word lemor, which is so common in the Bible, which means saying, or the expression ve'atah occurs like over 300 times in the Bible. It's the first word of the body of a letter. So it's a convention that they're learning. And I can give you lots of examples of how this carries along in speech, narrative framing according to speeches. You have biblical prophetic speech or other narratives. You have biblical prophetic speech, the entire genre of the writing prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, is framed essentially as an adaptation of writing a letter. So, thus says, speak to Shemaiah, thus you shall say, saying, thus says the Lord of God, host, because you sent letters. This is a nice example I like, because framed in this prophetic speech is a reference to the sending of letters. But the whole way that prophetic speech is a scribe's adaptation of what he learned in school, which was, how do I write a letter? Once I learn how to write a letter, then I take the genre and I adapt it in various and sundry ways. And this is, I could go on, and I think I've talked long enough. So let me, okay, well, there are really cool other examples of what's going on in this letter from Yahu. The first three words are variations of the Hebrew word amar, which means to speak. The first word is omer, speech. The second word is amar yao, which is a personal name, but it's the speech of God as a personal name. And then the third word is an imperative, speak to my Lord. And very, very typically, in cuneiform, you have grammatical exercises. One of the most interesting examples of this is actually a letter from Ugarit in alphabetic cuneiform, which does both things that our letter is doing. First of all, it gives you the introduction to a letter, message of so-and to so-and-so, to whoever. And then it plays with the body of the letter as a way of doing grammatical exercises. So, I request. Irshad, arshatu. I'm doing both the noun and verbal forms of the same root in Ugaritic. And then the whole body of the letter is really, in the end, a request for a drink of wine, but it uses all the different verbal forms of Natan to give an imperative, an imperfect, a gessive, a asseverative, a rhetorical question. So they just give you all the different kinds of forms, and you see the same kind of, exercises that went on in our example from Kuntillet Ajrud. Let me just give you one last and conclude this. I really also want to talk about advanced curriculum. So it's easy to talk about elementary curriculum, but it's nice to go further and talk about advanced curriculum in ancient Israel. And this is probably the hardest category of the curriculum, but maybe has the most potential too. And here you see in the third letter example, a mixture of the letter introduction, say to so and so, I bless you by God Tivon and his Asherah, and then you have sayings. Whatever he asks for a man, that man will give him generously. If he would urge, God would give him according to his heart's desire. Now, there's lots of different places in the Bible where you get certain kinds of replications of this expression. The Lord would give it according to his heart's desire. And what we think was happening is that you would memorize these kind of sayings, which is why you find variations of them in so many places. One of the closest parallels to it is actually a place in Psalm 100, verse 4, where it says, may he give you according to your heart's desire and fulfill all your plans. The reason I found this particular parallel of Psalm 20, verse 4 so interesting is because, wouldn't you know it, in the strangest of places, we find a parallel. In Egypt, we find a papyrus called Papyrus Amber 63. And in one of the columns, column 12, we get a really striking parallel. But you have to understand, Papyrus Amber dates to the 4th century BC. So that's like a half a century later. It's written in Aramaic language in Demotic script, which is why though it was published in 1899, it wasn't really fully understood until just the past few years. But in Papyrus Amur 63, in Egypt, in Aramaic, we find 4 verses from Psalm 20, verses 2 through 6, including the verse that we find in Kuntillet Ajrud, the saying that we find in Kuntillet Ajrud. And it goes to my general idea that advanced curriculum was probably memorized, it was probably oral, and then it was extremely conservative, some aspects of it. So generation after generation would pass on the same educational curriculum over and over again. And I think that one of the reasons that this fragment gets preserved in Kuntillet Ajrud is probably because it had its origins in the educational curriculum of early Israel. Thank you.